In the dusty hallways of Lincoln Elementary School in Little Rock, Arkansas, 10-year-old Malik Jackson moved like a shadow, quiet, unnoticed, and all too familiar with being overlooked. He wasn't the kid who flung spitballs across the room or cracked loud jokes to make the class erupt in laughter. No, Malik was the opposite. A boy with a sharp mind and a steady hand, always turning in his homework on time, his pencil marks neat and precise. But no matter how hard he tried, there was one truth he couldn't escape: he was invisible. Not the kind of invisible that comes with a superhero's cape, but the kind that stings, the kind that leaves you wondering if you even exist at all. It wasn't just the other kids who didn't see him. The teachers, especially Mrs. Harper, the music teacher with her hawk-like eyes and a voice that could cut glass, seemed to have perfected the art of looking right through him. Malik could raise his hand high, fingers trembling with the answer burning in his throat, only to watch Mrs. Harper's gaze slide past him like he was a ghost. She'd call on Cody instead. The rich kid with slick blonde hair and a smirk that screamed privilege, or maybe Lila, the quiet girl who always got a gentle nod even when she stumbled over her words. But Malik? His hand might as well have been air. Maybe they think I don't know anything, he'd tell himself, lowering his arm, the heat of embarrassment creeping up his neck. And yet, being ignored wasn't the worst of it. The real sting came when he slipped up. Something small, like missing a note during a group song or tripping over a lyric in music class. Where Cody would get a warm, "That's okay, try again." From Mrs. Harper, Malik got silence. Not the soft, forgiving kind, but a heavy, suffocating hush that hung in the air like a judgment. It was as if his every mistake confirmed something they'd already decided long ago: he's not good enough. He could feel it in the way her lips tightened, in the way her eyes narrowed just a fraction. As though she'd been waiting for him to prove her right. And the other kids noticed too, Cody especially, with his snide chuckles and whispered taunts. Guess some people just don't belong here. Malik wasn't a troublemaker, and he didn't fight back. He'd learned early on from his mama's tired but firm voice, "Keep your head down, Malik. The more they notice you, the more they'll find reasons to hate you." So he stayed quiet, swallowing the unfairness like a bitter pill, his small hands clenched into fists under his desk. But deep down, something simmered, a spark, a defiance he didn't yet have words for. He wasn't invisible because he wanted to be. He was invisible because they refused to see him. And every day, that refusal carved a little deeper, a silent wound no one else could see. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly guess, was that Malik carried something inside him. Something bigger than their petty judgments. It wasn't just his smarts or his determination. It was a gift, one passed down from his granddaddy, a jazz pianist whose fingers had once danced across keys in smoky bars and sunlit porches, filling the air with stories no one could ignore. Malik had sat by that old man's side for years, watching, learning, feeling the music sink into his bones. But he kept it hidden, locked away like a secret weapon, because he knew they'd never believe a boy like him could hold such power. Still, the weight of their doubt pressed harder every day. Mrs. Harper didn't just ignore him. She watched him, waiting. Cody didn't just tease, he baited, his eyes glinting with the hope of seeing Malik fall. They weren't content to let him fade into the background. They wanted him to fail, to stumble so badly they could point and laugh and say, "See? We told you so." It was a game Malik hadn't signed up for, but one he couldn't avoid. And as the days ticked by in that cramped, chalk-dusted classroom, he felt the tension building. Like a storm gathering on the horizon. Sooner or later, something would break. He just didn't know it would happen so soon, or that it would start with the sound of a piano key. The air in Lincoln Elementary's music room felt thicker that Tuesday morning, heavy with the hum of restless chatter and the faint squeak of sneakers on the worn wooden floor. Malik sat near the window, his small frame hunched over a notebook, scribbling the last of his homework as sunlight sliced through the dusty panes. He liked these quiet moments before class. A brief escape where he could be himself without the weight of those judging eyes. But today that peace shattered faster than a dropped glass. Mrs. Harper swept into the room like a storm cloud. Her heels clicking sharply against the floor, her graying hair pulled tight into a bun that seemed to mirror her pinched expression. The chatter died instantly, replaced by an uneasy stillness as every pair of eyes turned to her. She dropped her folder onto the desk with a deliberate thud, then scanned the room, her gaze lingering just a heartbeat too long on Malik. He felt it, a prickle down his spine, like a deer sensing a hunter in the brush. Something was coming. Malik Jackson, she said, her voice slicing through the silence like a blade. Head swiveled toward him and he froze, pencil hovering mid-stroke. Today's a special day. We've got a talent check in the auditorium after lunch. Every student, every teacher in the school will be there. I hear your granddaddy was some kind of piano man. So, I reckon you've picked up a thing or two, haven't you? Her lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't warm. It was the kind of smile a cat gives a cornered mouse. Be ready. You're playing for us all. The room erupted. Cody, sprawled in his seat with his arms draped over the backrest, let out a loud, barking laugh. What him? He's gonna trip over the keys and cry. A few kids snickered, their voices buzzing like flies around Malik's ears. Lila, the quiet girl with braids who sat 2 desks over, shot him a quick, worried glance, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. Even little Tommy, who usually minded his own business, whispered to his neighbor, does he even know how to play? The doubt was a living thing, slithering through the class, wrapping tighter around Malik with every word. He didn't flinch, though his stomach twisted into a knot. This wasn't an invitation. It was a trap sprung with cold precision. Mrs. Harper hadn't asked because she believed in him. She'd heard whispers about his granddaddy, the jazz legend who'd once made Keys sing in places she'd never set foot in. And she'd assumed Malik was just a kid with a borrowed story, not a real talent. She wanted him to fail publicly, spectacularly on that auditorium stage in front of hundreds of kids and teachers who'd never given him a second thought. After lunch meant no time to practice, no chance to prepare. Just raw exposure. A spotlight primed to burn. Malik's mind raced. He could say no, duck his head, and let her write him off as a coward. See, he's got nothing to show, she'd say, and Cody would howl with glee. Or he could step into her game, knowing every eye would be waiting for him to stumble, to prove he didn't belong. The weight of it pressed down, heavy as the old piano he'd seen gathering dust in the auditorium corner. He could still hear his mama's warning. Don't give them a reason to hate you. But then he thought of Granddaddy. His gravelly voice humming over the keys. Music ain't just sound, Malik. It's your fight when they try to shut you up. The class was still buzzing, Cody's taunts growing louder, Mrs. Harper's eyes glinting with smug certainty. Malik set his pencil down, slow and deliberate, then lifted his chin. His voice came out steady, quieter than the chaos around him but sharp enough to cut through it. All right, Mrs. Harper. I'll play. The laughter faltered. Cody's grin flickered like a bulb about to blow. Lila's eyes widened. A mix of shock and something softer, hope, maybe? Mrs. Harper blinked just once, then nodded curtly. Good. I'm looking forward to it. But her tone wasn't encouragement, it was a dare, laced with the promise of humiliation. She turned back to her desk, dismissing him, but Malik caught the flicker in her expression. She thought she'd won already. As the bell rang for lunch, the room emptied in a rush, kids spilling into the hall with whispers trailing behind them. Malik stayed put for a moment, staring at the window, the sunlight now harsh against his face. His best friend, Jamal, slid into the seat beside him, his voice low and urgent. You sure about this, man? She's setting you up. Cody's gonna eat this up if you mess it up. Malik didn't look at him right away. He thought of the auditorium, that creaky stage, the sea of faces ready to judge. He thought of Mrs. Harper's smirk, Cody's sneer, the way they'd all written him off before he'd even touched a key. Then he thought of Granddaddy's hands, rough, steady, fearless, guiding his own over the piano at home. A faint smile tugged at his lips, not loud or proud but certain. Let him try, he said finally, standing up. They don't know what's coming. Jamal raised an eyebrow, half grinning despite himself. You're crazy, you know that? But there was a spark in his eyes, like he believed Malik might just pull it off. As Malik stepped into the hall, the noise of the school swallowed him up, kids shouting, lockers slamming, the distant clang of trays in the cafeteria. But inside, he was calm, a quiet storm brewing. Mrs. Harper thought she'd cornered him. Cody thought he'd get a show worth laughing at. They were wrong. This wasn't their game anymore. It was his. And when the auditorium lights hit that stage after lunch, he'd make sure they never forgot it. The auditorium at Lincoln Elementary buzzed like a hive on the brink of chaos, as the lunch bell faded into memory. Rows of kids, from tiny first graders with swinging legs to fifth graders slouched with practice boredom, packed the creaky wooden seats. Teachers lined the walls, arms crossed, their murmurs blending with the rustle of restless bodies. The air smelled of stale popcorn and nervous sweat. And in the center of it all stood an old piano, its chipped black paint and yellowed keys a silent witness to years of neglect. Malik Jackson, all 10 years of him, felt every eye in that room boring into his back as he stepped onto the stage. He'd barely eaten at lunch, his stomach too tight to handle more than a bite of bread. Jamal had tried to lighten the mood, cracking jokes about Cody tripping over his own ego, but Malik's mind was elsewhere, on the keys, on the music, on the weight of what was about to happen. Now, standing under the harsh auditorium lights, he could hear the whispers ripple through the crowd. Cody sat front and center, his blonde hair gleaming like a spotlight of its own, grinning wide enough to show teeth. "This is gonna be a disaster," he stage whispered, loud enough for half the room to hear. A few kids giggled, others leaned forward, eager for the show. Mrs. Harper stood off to the side, her arms folded, her face a mask of cool anticipation. She didn't say a word, but her eyes screamed it. "Fail. Prove me right." Malik's sneakers squeaked against the warped stage floor as he approached the piano. Up close it looked worse than he'd imagined. Dust clung to its edges, and a faint musty smell rose from the wood. He brushed his fingers over the keys, feeling their uneven texture, the way some stuck slightly under his touch. This wasn't Granddaddy's piano, smooth and warm from years of love. This was a relic, a challenge in itself. For a split second, doubt flickered, could he even make this thing sing? But then he caught Cody's smirk, Mrs. Harper's steady stare, and something inside him snapped into place. They wanted a fall? He'd give them a rise instead. He sat down, the bench groaning under his slight weight, and took a deep breath. The room went quiet, not the respectful kind, but the kind that waits for a crash. His hands hovered over the keys, small and steady, and then he pressed down. The first note rang out, soft and low, a single drop in a still pond. It was a blues melody, the kind Granddaddy used to play on lazy summer afternoons, slow and soulful, pulling you in before you knew it. A few kids shifted, unsure, but no one laughed yet. Malik let the notes build, his fingers finding their rhythm, coaxing life from the tired instrument. Then he shifted gears. The melody twisted, quickened, his hands danced faster, striking chords that rolled like thunder across the auditorium. It wasn't just blues anymore, it was something bigger, fiercer, a storm of sound that swallowed the room whole. His foot tapped the floor, keeping time as he leaned into the keys, every muscle alive with the music. The sticky keys didn't matter. He forced them to obey, bending the piano to his will. The crowd's whispers died. Cody's grin froze, then faded. Lila, wide-eyed in the third row, gripped the edge of her seat. Even the teacher straightened, caught off guard by the sheer force pouring from this scrawny kid they'd never bothered to notice. Malik didn't look up. He didn't need to. He could feel it, the shift. The way the air thickened with awe instead of mockery. He hit a complex run, fingers flying over the keys with a precision that belied his age. Then slammed into a chord so deep it rattled the windows. The sound hung there, bold and unapologetic, a declaration no one could ignore. And then, just as the room seemed ready to burst, he stopped. His hands lifted, the final note echoing into silence, and for a heartbeat nothing moved. One clap broke the spell, Jamal grinning like a fool from the back. Then another, then a flood. The auditorium exploded with applause, kids stomping their feet, some standing up, their cheers bouncing off the walls. Lila clapped so hard her hands turned red. Cody slouched lower, arms crossed, his face a mix of shock and something sour. Mrs. Harper didn't move, didn't clap, her lips pressed into a thin line, her knuckles white where they gripped her elbows. She'd wanted to stumble, a flop, a reason to say, "I told you so." Instead, Malik had turned her trap into a triumph. He stood slowly, brushing his hands on his jeans, and faced the crowd. The noise washed over him, loud and wild. But he didn't smile, not yet. His eyes found Mrs. Harper's, steady and unflinching. She broke first, looking away, her mask cracking just enough to show the rattled woman beneath. Malik stepped off the stage, the applause still ringing in his ears, and headed for the door. He didn't need their cheers to know what he'd done. He played his truth, loud and clear. And no one, not Cody, not Mrs. Harper, not a single soul in that room, could pretend he was invisible anymore. But this wasn't the end. The echoes of those keys had shaken something loose. And as he slipped into the hallway, he knew the real fight was just beginning. They'd seen him now. They couldn't unsee him. And that was a power all its own. The echoes of that afternoon in the auditorium didn't fade with the final bell. They lingered. threading through the halls of Lincoln Elementary like an invisible current, shifting the air in ways no one could quite name. Malik Jackson walked out of that stage a different boy, not in his quiet steps or the way he tucked his hands into his pockets, but in the space he now occupied. For the first time, he wasn't a shadow slipping through the cracks. He was a presence, undeniable and real, and the school felt it. The next morning, the classroom buzzed with a strange energy. Kids who'd never spared him a glance now stole quick looks as he slid into his seat by the window. Jamal plopped down beside him, his grin wide and unapologetic. Man, you should have seen Cody's face yesterday. Looked like he swallowed a lemon whole. Malik let out a soft huff, almost a laugh. But his eyes stayed on the scratched desk in front of him. He didn't need Jamal to tell him what he'd already felt. The shift, the crack in the wall they built to keep him out. Mrs. Harper entered, her heels clicking with the same sharp rhythm, but something was off. Her shoulders were stiff, her jaw tight, and when her gaze swept the room, it didn't glide over Malik like it used to. Pause, just for a heartbeat before moving on. She cleared her throat louder than necessary and launched into the day's lesson, a dry lecture about scales and rhythm. But no one was really listening. Lila, twisting her braids nervously, kept sneaking glances at Malik. Tommy whispered to his neighbor, "He's gotta play again sometime, right?" Even Cody, slouched with his arms crossed, didn't crack his usual taunts. His silence spoke louder than any jab ever had. The change wasn't loud or obvious, no banners, no speeches, no grand apologies. It was subtler, deeper. When Malik raised his hand later that hour, the room stilled. Mrs. Harper's chalk froze mid-scrawl, and for a moment she hesitated, something she'd never done before. She could have ignored him, picked someone else like always, but too many eyes were watching now. "Yes, Malik," she said, her voice clipped but steady. He answered calm and sure. About the difference between a half note and a quarter note. She nodded curtly correct and turned back to the board, but the air felt different. The class had seen her bend just a little. And that was enough. At lunch, the cafeteria hummed with its usual chaos, trays clattering, voices overlapping, but Malik's table wasn't empty anymore. Jamal was there, of course. But Lila slid in across from him, her juice box in hand. She didn't say much at first, just watched him with those quiet, thoughtful eyes. Finally she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "Why didn't you tell anyone you could play like that?" Malik shrugged, poking at his mashed potatoes. "Didn't think anyone care." She tilted her head, considering, then nodded. "They care now." She was right. Kids he didn't even know nodded at him in the halls there. "Hey, Malik," tentative but real. Tommy asked him once shyly if he'd ever play at recess. Even Cody, passing by with his tray, muttered a grudging, "Not bad, Jackson," before stalking off. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was something. Respect, maybe, or at least the start of it. Malik didn't chase it, didn't need it to feel whole. He'd never played for their approval. He played for himself, for Granddaddy's voice in his head, for the truth they tried to bury. The teachers felt it too, though they hid it better. Mrs. Harper didn't call on him often, but when she did, her tone lacked the old edge. She couldn't pretend he didn't exist anymore, not without the class noticing, not without them questioning. Once during a group activity she paired him with Lila instead of leaving him last. And Malik caught the flicker of unease in her eyes. She knew she'd lost something that day on the stage, not just control but the power to define him. And that gnawed at her, even if she'd never admit it. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the schoolyard gold, Malik lingered by the gate, his backpack slung over one shoulder. The day had been ordinary, lessons, chatter, the usual hum, but he felt lighter, like a weight he'd carried too long had finally lifted. Then a voice stopped him cold. "Malik." He turned. And there she was, Mrs. Harper, standing alone, her coat buttoned tight against the chill. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes held something new, something unsteady. "You think you've changed everything, don't you?" she said, her words slow, testing. Malik didn't flinch. He met her gaze, his voice quiet but firm. "I didn't change anything. I just showed what was already there." For a moment, she didn't move, didn't speak. Then her lips twitched, not quite a smile but close, before she turned away, her heels clicking into the distance. It wasn't an apology, wasn't praise, but it was enough. She knew. They all did. The next day Malik walked into class with his head high, not because he'd won some grand battle, but because he didn't have to hide anymore. The glances didn't slide past him. The silences didn't swallow him. He sat down, opened his notebook, and let the world turn around him. He didn't need their cheers or their guilt. He'd made them listen, made them see, and that was his victory. A quiet, unshakable thing no one could take away. As he left school that evening, the sunset stretching wide and warm ahead, Malik thought of Granddaddy, of the stories in those keys, the strength in those hands. He'd carried that legacy onto the stage and let it speak. And now, every step he took rang with its echo, a sound that stayed long after the music stopped. Weeks turned into months at Lincoln Elementary, and the memory of Malik Jackson's auditorium triumph didn't fade. It grew roots. The school wasn't the same anymore, not in the big, obvious ways like new rules or painted walls, but in the small, quiet shifts that stuck. Kids who once raced past him in the halls now slowed down their hey Malik's, carrying a weight they hadn't before. Teachers who'd skimmed over his name on the roster now paused when they said it, as if testing its new shape in their mouths. Malik didn't strut or boast, he didn't need to. The music had done its work, and he carried it with him like a second heartbeat. But it wasn't just about him anymore. The echoes of those keys had stirred something bigger. One rainy recess, when the kids were stuck inside, Tommy, the shy boy who'd barely spoken to Malik before, sidled up to him with a nervous grin. "You think you could teach me a little? You know, on the piano." His voice was small, but his eyes were bright, hopeful. Malik blinked, caught off guard, then nodded. "Sure. It's not hard once you feel it." The next day, Lila joined them, her braids bouncing as she tapped out a clumsy tune on the classroom's beat-up keyboard. A handful of others trickled in, kids who'd clapped that day in the auditorium, kids who'd never cared until they'd heard him play. They called it Malik's Music Club, half-joking at first. But it stuck. Mrs. Harper noticed. She couldn't not notice the laughter, the off-key plinks, the way her music room filled with a life it hadn't known before. Her lessons grew sharper, her rules stricter, as if she could drown out the change with scales and worksheets. But even she couldn't stop it. One afternoon, she caught Malik showing Tommy how to stretch his fingers for a chord, and her lips tightened. "This isn't playtime, Jackson," she snapped. Malik looked up, calm as ever. "We're learning, Mrs. Harper. Isn't that what music's for?" She didn't answer, just turned away, but the stiffness in her stride said she'd heard him loud and clear. The club wasn't perfect, fingers fumbled, tempers flared. And the old keyboard wheezed like it might give up any day, but it was theirs. Malik didn't teach like a teacher, all stern and stiff. He taught like Granddaddy had, with stories and patience, letting them find the rhythm in their own time. "It's not about being good," he'd say, his voice steady over their hesitant notes. "It's about saying something." And they listened, not because he demanded it, but because they'd seen what he could do when he let his hand speak. Then came the spring talent show. A school tradition that usually spotlighted the same faces. Cody with his flashy dance moves, the choir girls with their polished harmonies. This year, though, whispers started early. "Malik's gotta play again," Tommy said one lunch, loud enough for half the cafeteria to hear. Lila nodded, fierce for once. "He should. And we should too." The idea caught fire, Malik leading his ragtag club on that auditorium stage, not just for him but for them all. Jamal clapped him on the back, grinning. "You started this, man. Gotta finish it." Malik wasn't so sure. He'd never wanted the spotlight, never needed it to prove himself again. But the kids' eyes, Tommy's quiet hope, Lila's stubborn faith, pulled at him. He thought of Granddaddy, of the way music had carried him through harder days than these. "All right," he said finally. "But we do it together." The night of the show arrived. The auditorium packed tighter than it had been that first time. Cody went first, all swagger and spins, soaking up the cheers like he owned the place. Then Malik's group shuffled on 5 kids, mismatched and nervous, with Malik at the piano. Mrs. Harper sat in the front row, her face a wall of stone, waiting for them to falter. The crowd hushed, unsure what to expect from this scrappy crew. Malik struck the first note, soft and steady, a lifeline for the others. Tommy joined in, his rhythm shaky but earnest. Lila layered a simple melody, her fingers trembling but sure. The rest followed, their sounds weaving into something raw, messy, alive. It wasn't perfect, notes clashed, tempos wobbled, but it was real. A story of kids who'd found their voice because one boy had dared to use his. Malik anchored it all, his chords rising like a tide, lifting them higher until the last note rang out, bold and unbroken. The applause wasn't as wild as before, It built slow then swelled, a wave of sound that crashed over them. Cody clapped too, slow and grudging, his smirk nowhere in sight. Mrs. Harper didn't move, but her eyes flickered, caught between pride and something she'd never name. Malik stood with his club, their faces flushed and grinning, and for the first time, he let himself smile small quiet. But there. Later, as the crowd thinned and the auditorium emptied, Malik lingered by the piano, running his fingers over the keys. Jamal nudged him. "You're famous now, huh?" Malik shook his head, his voice low. "Nah, just not invisible anymore." He thought of Granddaddy of the club of the kids who'd found something in the music he'd shared. He'd started alone, a boy against a trap. But now he wasn't. The melody had grown, and it wasn't just his anymore, it belonged to them all. As he walked home under a sky streaked with stars, Malik felt the weight of it settle, not heavy, but warm. He'd broken through, not with shouts or fights, but with the quiet power of who he was. And that he knew was a sound that would never fade. The spring talent show hadn't just changed Lincoln Elementary, it had sent ripples beyond the school's chipped brick walls. Word of Malik Jackson and his scrappy music club spread through Little Rock like a tune carried on the wind. Teachers talked about it over coffee, kids bragged to their cousins, and somehow, a grainy video of their performance, shot on Jamal's shaky phone, landed in the hands of a local radio host. By summer's end, an invitation arrived. The Arkansas Young Artists Festival, a statewide event where the best talents under 12 vied for attention on a real stage, with real judges and a crowd that stretched far beyond the schoolyard. Malik's name was on the list. At first, he didn't believe it. "Me? Play there?" he asked, staring at the letter his mama held out, her eyes shining with the pride she rarely let show. "You earned it, baby," she said, her voice soft but firm. "They heard you. Now the world's gotta hear too." The club erupted when he told them. Tommy hooped, Lila hugged him so tight he couldn't breathe, and Jamal just grinned, saying, "Told you you're famous now." But beneath their excitement, Malik felt a new weight settle in his chest. This wasn't the auditorium anymore. This was bigger, scarier, and he wasn't sure he was ready. The festival loomed 2 months away, set for a crisp November night in a downtown theater with velvet seats and lights that blazed like stars. Malik and the club threw themselves into practice, meeting after school in the music room, their fingers stumbling over borrowed keyboards and a piano Mrs. Harper grudgingly let them use. She didn't say much, just hovered sometimes, her presence a silent challenge. Cody, meanwhile, had his own spot in the festival, some slick dance routine his parents paid a coach to perfect, and he made sure Malik knew it. "You're out of your league, Jackson," he sneered one day, leaning against the doorframe. "That little club won't save you up there." Malik didn't bite back. He just kept playing, letting the notes answer for him. But Cody wasn't the only pressure. The festival wasn't just a stage, it was a proving ground, with judges from music schools and talent scouts in the crowd. Word got around that a big prize was on the line. A scholarship to a summer arts program, a chance to learn from real musicians. For Malik, it wasn't about the prize, it was about showing he belonged not just to Lincoln, but to a world that had never looked his way before. The club felt it too. "We're with you," Lila said one evening, her voice fierce. "All the way." Tommy nodded, his hands steadier on the keys now. They weren't just playing for fun anymore, they were playing for something real. The night arrived, cold and clear, the theater glowing against the dark Arkansas sky. Backstage, Malik peeked through the curtain at a sea of faces, hundreds, maybe 1,000, chatting, laughing, waiting. His stomach churned, his palms slick with sweat. Cody strutted past, all confidence in gelled hair, flashing a smirk. "Don't choke, piano boy." Malik ignored him, focusing on the club. Tommy clutching his sheet music, Lila whispering encouragement, Jamal cracking nervous jokes. They were a team, small and scrappy, but together. When their turn came, the announcer's voice boomed, "Next up, Malik Jackson and the Lincoln Music Club." The crowd clapped politely as they shuffled on stage, the lights blinding, the piano gleaming like it belonged in a dream. Malik sat, his heart hammering, and glanced at his friends. They nodded, scared but ready. He pressed the first key, a single note cutting through the noise, and the world shrank to just them and the music. Started slow, a bluesy thread tying their sounds together, Tommy's steady beat, Lila's fragile melody, the others filling the gaps. Then Malik took the lead, his fingers unleashing a torrent of chords. Fierce and free, pulling the club along like a river lifting boats. The crowd leaned in, caught by the raw energy of kids who played like their lives depended on it. Halfway through, Tommy missed a note, a sharp clang that made him flinch, but Malik didn't stop. He wove it in, turned the mistake into something new, and the club followed, their music swelling into a wild, beautiful chaos. The final chord hit like a thunderclap, ringing out as they froze, breathless, under the lights. Silence. Then an explosion, applause, cheers, feet stomping the floor. The judges scribbled furiously, the crowd surged to its feet, and somewhere in the roar, Malik heard Jamal yell, "That's my boy." Cody's polished act had dazzled earlier, but this was alive. Messy human. Malik stood, his club beside him, and for the first time, he let the noise sink in. He didn't see Mrs. Harper in the audience, didn't know if she'd come, but he felt Granddaddy there. And the keys in the air. Backstage, the judges called them up. No scholarship, not this time. Cody's name topped that list, his parents beaming in the front row. But the head judge, a gray-haired woman with kind eyes, pulled Malik aside. "You've got something special, kid," she said, pressing a card into his hand. "Keep playing. We'll be watching." It wasn't a prize, but it was a promise, and that was more than enough. Later, under the theater's marquee, the club huddled together, laughing, their breath fogging in the night. "We did it," Lila said, her voice trembling with pride. Tommy nodded, quieter but sure. "Yeah, we did." Malik looked at them, his friends, his family now, and felt the melody that had started it all still humming inside him. He'd faced the world and won, not with trophies but with the truth of who he was. Walking home, the stars sharp overhead, Malik thought of Granddaddy's words. "Music's your fight, Malik. Let it speak." He had. And now it wasn't just his fight. It was theirs, a sound that stretched beyond Little Rock, beyond that night, into a future he could finally see. The keys had opened a door, and he wasn't turning back. The Arkansas Young Artists Festival faded into winter, but its echoes clung to Malik Jackson like frost on a windowpane. At 10 years old, he'd faced a theater full of strangers and walked away with something bigger than a prize, a quiet certainty that his music mattered. Back at Lincoln Elementary, life settled into a new rhythm. The music club grew, spilling beyond the classroom into recess and after-school hours, their off-key notes a familiar hum in the school's bones. Malik was their anchor, steady and patient, but inside, a question gnawed at him: what now? He'd proven himself, to the school, to the festival, to the world. So why did it feel like something was still missing? It started with a phone call. One gray December afternoon, Mama handed him the receiver, her face tight with something he couldn't read. "It's the hospital," she said, her voice low. Granddaddy was sick, really sick this time. Not just the coughs and aches Malik had brushed off as old age. Pneumonia, the doctor said. His lungs too weak to fight after years of smoke-filled bars and late-night gigs. Malik's world tilted. Granddaddy wasn't just a memory or a teacher, he was the root of everything, the hands that had guided his own, the voice that had told him to fight. And now that voice was fading. The next day, Malik sat by Granddaddy's bed, the hospital room cold and sterile, the beep of machines a cruel counterpoint to the silence between them. The old man looked smaller than ever, his skin ashen, his breath shallow, but his eyes, those sharp, knowing eyes, still burned. "You did good, boy," he rasped, a faint smile cracking his dry lips. "Heard about that festival. Made him listen, didn't ya?" Malik nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Granddaddy's hand, trembling but firm, gripped his. "Don't stop now. Music's bigger than you. It's us. Keep it alive." Those words stuck, heavy and urgent as the days blurred. Granddaddy slipped away a week later, quiet as a final note fading into the air. The funeral was small, family, a few old jazzmen with weathered faces. The club kids huddled in the back pews, but Malik felt the loss like a hole in his chest. He didn't cry, not then. He sat at the old piano in their living room that night, fingers tracing the keys Granddaddy had played, and let the silence speak. But silence wasn't enough anymore. He had to do something, something big, something lasting. The idea came slow, then hit hard. A concert, not for a prize or a crowd, but for Granddaddy, for the club, for every kid like him who'd ever felt invisible. He pitched it to the school. A winter showcase, open to the whole neighborhood, with the music club at its heart. Mrs. Harper resisted at first, her lips pursed. "We don't have the budget, Jackson." But the principal, who'd seen the festival video, overruled her. "Let the boy try," he said, and Malik did. The club threw themselves into it, Tommy sketching flyers, Lila begging her uncle for a sound system, Jamal roping in half the fifth grade to spread the word. They practiced in the auditorium, their music rough but fierce, Malik weaving Granddaddy's blues into every piece. Word spread beyond Lincoln, parents, shopkeepers, even the radio host who'd started it all promised to come. Cody scoffed when he heard another piano stunt. Lame, but Malik didn't care. This wasn't about proving anything to him. The night arrived, snow dusting the ground, the auditorium packed with faces. Some familiar, some strange. Malik's hand shook as he stepped on stage. The club behind him, the old piano gleaming under borrowed lights. He looked out, Mama in the front row, her eyes wet, the jazzmen from the funeral nodding approval, Mrs. Harper in the back. Arms crossed but there. The crowd hushed and Malik spoke, his voice steady despite the ache in his chest. This is for my granddaddy. He taught me music's a fight. Tonight, it's ours. The first note rang out, low, mournful, a blues that carried Granddaddy's soul. The club joined in, their sounds raw and alive, telling a story of loss, of strength, of kids who'd found their place. Malik played like never before, his fingers a blur, pouring everything into the keys, the hospital room, the funeral, the promise he'd made. The crowd didn't just listen, they felt it, swaying, some crying, others clapping along. When the last chord hit, deep and final, the room erupted, louder than the festival, louder than anything Malik had known. After, people pressed forward, strangers shaking his hand, the radio host offering airtime, a jazzman promising to teach him tricks Granddaddy never got to. Mrs. Harper lingered last, her face softer than he'd ever seen. You're stubborn, Jackson, she said, almost a compliment. He'd be proud. Malik nodded, too full to speak. Cody wasn't there, he'd skipped it, but that didn't matter. This wasn't his stage. Later, under a sky heavy with snow, Malik walked home with the club, their laughter cutting through the cold. We're legends now, Jamal said, and Lila giggled, maybe? Tommy just smiled, quiet but sure. Malik looked back at the school, its lights fading, and felt Granddaddy's hand on his shoulder, not real. But there, he'd kept the music alive, not just for himself, but for them all, for every kid who'd ever been unseen, every note that refused to fade. The hole in his chest didn't close, but it changed, less empty, more full. Malik wasn't invisible anymore, and neither was the legacy he carried. The keys had started it, the club had grown it, and now the world would remember it, a melody rooted deep, stretching wide, forever unbroken. Winter melted into spring at Lincoln Elementary, and the snow of that unforgettable concert gave way to budding trees and longer days. Malik Jackson, now 11, carried the weight of the past year like a melody he couldn't shake. Granddaddy's passing, the music club's triumph, the neighborhood's applause still ringing in his ears. The school had changed for good. The auditorium piano, once a dusty relic, now gleamed with care, tuned weekly by a janitor who'd heard Malik play. The club wasn't just a recess pastime anymore, it was a fixture, a heartbeat, with new kids joining every month, their clumsy notes a testament to the fire Malik had lit. But life doesn't stand still. And neither did Malik. The concert had planted seeds he hadn't expected. The radio host who'd come that night kept his word. Malik's voice crackled over the airwaves one Saturday, telling Little Rock about Granddaddy, about the club, about music as a fight. Calls flooded in, parents, musicians, even a producer from Memphis who'd caught the broadcast on a drive through town. You've got a gift, kid, the producer said over a scratchy phone line, his voice smooth as vinyl. Ever thought about recording? Maybe a real stage bigger than Arkansas? Malik froze. The idea too vast to hold. Recording? A stage beyond Little Rock? He mumbled a maybe, but the seed was sown. Summer brought a new challenge. The producer sent a letter, an offer to cut a demo in Memphis, 3 songs, all expenses paid, if Malik could get there by July. It wasn't a promise of fame, just a chance. But it loomed larger than the festival, larger than the concert. Mama read it twice, her hands trembling. This could be it, Malik, she said, her eyes searching his. But it's your call. The club rallied, Jamal hooped, you're gonna be a star. Lila frowned, practical as ever, how do we get you there? Tommy just nodded, his faith quiet but unshakable. Malik felt the pull, of Granddaddy's legacy, of his own dreams, but also the fear. Memphis was hours away, a city of strangers, and he was still just a kid. He turned to the piano for answers, sitting alone in the living room where Granddaddy's spirit still lingered. The keys felt different now, less like a shield, more like a bridge. He played soft at first, then fierce, letting the notes wrestle with his doubts. What if he failed? What if he wasn't enough? But then he remembered the auditorium, the festival, the concert. Every time he'd faced the unknown and made it his own. The music didn't lie. Carried him through, always would. The decision came quiet, like a chord resolving. I'm going. He told Mama, the club, himself. They scrambled fundraisers at school, a bake sale led by Lila's mom, Jamal hawking flyers like a carnival barker. Mrs. Harper, to everyone's shock, slipped a crisp 20 into the jar, her face unreadable. Don't embarrass us, she muttered, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of something, pride, maybe, or resignation. By June, they had enough: bus tickets, a cheap motel, a dream stitched together with grit and hope. The day he left, the club saw him off at the station, their faces a mix of excitement and nerves. Play like you mean it, Tommy said, handing him a crumpled drawing of the piano. Lila hugged him tight, whispering, "You're still ours, okay?" Jamal grinned. "Bring back a record with my name on it." Malik nodded, his throat too full to speak, and boarded the bus, the weight of their trust heavier than his suitcase. Memphis hit him like a wave, hot, loud, alive. The studio was small, cluttered with cables and coffee cups, but the producer greeted him like an old friend. "Let's hear what you've got," he said, leaning back in a creaky chair. Malik sat at the piano, a sleek, shining thing worlds away from Lincoln's relic, and played 3 songs. A blues for Granddaddy, a wild jam for the club, a quiet piece for himself. His fingers flew, steady and sure, the room filling with a sound that was all his, raw, real, unbreakable. The producer didn't clap, just nodded, slow and thoughtful. "We've got something here," he said, scribbling notes. "Something big." Back home, the demo aired on the radio, a crackly broadcast that stopped Little Rock in its tracks. Mama cried, the club cheered, and somewhere, Malik knew Granddaddy was listening. No contracts came yet, no big break, just a tape, a start, a whisper of what could be. But it was enough. He'd stepped beyond the school, beyond the town, and the world had heard. Years later, Malik would look back on that summer, the bus ride, the studio, the keys that carried him. He'd play bigger stages, cut real records, but he'd never forget Lincoln, the club, the beginning. The boy who'd been invisible had built a legacy, not just for himself, but for every kid who'd ever felt unseen. And as he walked into the future, the music stayed his fight, his truth. A sound that stretched beyond the horizon, forever his own. And so Malik Jackson's story doesn't end with a big, shiny Grammy or a mansion full of gold records, not yet, anyway. It ends with a kid, a piano, and a bus ticket to somewhere bigger than he'd ever dreamed. But here's the kicker. Malik's not some dusty legend from a history book. His fight, the one that started with a beat-up piano in a room full of doubters, is still playing out today, right here, right now. You see, we've all got our own Mrs. Harpers and Codys, haven't we? The boss who skips over your ideas, the friend who snickers when you trip, the voice in your head that says you're not enough. Malik didn't have a magic wand or a superhero cape. He had keys, grit, and a club of misfits who believed in him. Sound familiar? Think about it. In 2025, we're still scrolling X, dodging haters, and trying to make our mark in a world that's loud and fast and sometimes blind. Malik's story isn't just a feel-good tale, it's a playbook. You don't need to be 11 or a piano prodigy to get it. Maybe your keys are a paintbrush, a laptop, a skateboard, heck, even a killer cookie recipe. The trick? Play it loud, play it true, and don't wait for permission. And if you fall flat because, let's be real, we all do sometimes, pick up the tune and keep going. Malik did, and look where it got him. A demo in Memphis and a legacy that's still humming. Here's the funny part. We love to cheer for the underdog, but half the time we're too busy doom scrolling to notice we're the underdog ourselves. So, take a page from Malik's songbook, stop waiting for the spotlight and start making noise. Who knows? Your Memphis might be just one brave note away. What's your piano, huh? What's that thing you've been hiding because you're scared they'll laugh? Drop it in the comments, I'm dying to hear, and I bet the rest of this crew is too. Oh, and before you bounce, don't forget to smash that subscribe button. We've got more stories like Malik's coming your way, full of heart, hustle, and maybe a little chaos. Hit that bell so you don't miss the next beat. Thanks for sticking with us. Now go make some noise of your own.